The silence in the penthouse was not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest, but rather the predatory stillness of a jungle just before the trap snaps shut. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere that I had learned to navigate with the careful precision of a bomb disposal expert. I sat at the vanity table, staring into the reflection of a woman I barely recognized, a creature draped in emerald silk and diamonds that cost more than the neighborhood I grew up in, trying to slow the frantic hammering of a heart that knew, deep down in its ventricles, that the walls were finally closing in. For 6 months, I had played the role of the grateful stray, the beautiful, tragic orphan with no past and no ties, allowing Kalen, the Saint Santo, to mold me into the perfect Mafia Don's ornament, all while I desperately siphoned off pieces of his fortune to keep the only family I had left alive in a sterile facility halfway across the world. The brush in my hand trembled ever so slightly as I ran it through my hair, the bristles scraping against my scalp in a rhythmic cadence that failed to soothe the jagged edges of my anxiety. Because this morning felt different, heavier, charged with static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up in warning. Usually, by this hour, Kalen would have already left for the warehouse district, or his high-rise office, leaving a lingering scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder on the sheets. But today, the heavy oak door to his study had remained closed, sealing in whatever darkness he was currently contemplating. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had been careful with the transfers, routing them through 3 different shell companies before they ever touched the Swiss account. Yet the logic did little to quell the nausea churning in my stomach like a tempest. I looked at the clock, the digital numbers mocking me with their relentless march forward, and I considered, for perhaps the 1000th time, grabbing the emergency bag I had stashed beneath the loose floorboard in the guest closet and running until my legs gave out. But I knew with a terrifying certainty that there was nowhere on this earth Kalen Santo's reach could not find me. He was a man who collected things, art, weapons, enemies' fingers, and he had decided, with a terrifying finality, that he had collected me, possessing me with a clinical obsession that bordered on religious fervor. To leave him would be a death sentence, not just for me, but for the fragile life I was paying to protect. The one person whose blood shared the same cursed history as mine. The sound of the bedroom door opening was not loud, merely a soft click of the latch releasing, yet it echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot, freezing the breath in my lungs and forcing my hand to pause mid-stroke. In the mirror, I saw him enter, a towering figure of broad shoulders and lethal grace, wearing a suit that was tailored so sharply it could probably cut glass, his expression a mask of terrifying neutrality that gave away absolutely nothing of his internal state. Kalen moved with the silent, fluid lethality of a panther stalking through tall grass, his eyes fixed on the back of my neck with an intensity that made my skin burn. And though I desperately wanted to turn around and smile, to play the part of the doting lover, my body refused to obey the commands of my brain. He didn't speak immediately, which was always worse than the yelling, because silence was where Kalen thrived, a void he created so that others would rush to fill it with their own nervous confessions. Instead of greeting me, he walked slowly toward the vanity, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug until he was standing directly behind me, his hands resting heavily on my shoulders, his thumbs digging into the soft flesh near my collarbone with a pressure that was just on the shy side of painful. I met his gaze in the mirror, searching those storm-gray irises for a hint of warmth, for the man who whispered possessive prayers against my skin in the dark. But all I found was a cold, analytical calculation, as if he were dissecting a frog in a biology lab to see what made it tick. "You look beautiful, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through my chest bone, sending a confusing mixture of arousal and terror shooting through my nervous system, because even when he terrified me, my body betrayed me by responding to his proximity. "Like a porcelain doll, flawless and empty, without a single scratch to show where you came from or who you belonged to before I found you shivering in the rain." "I belong to you, Kalen," I replied, the rehearsed line slipping from my lips with practiced ease, though my voice sounded thin and brittle to my own ears, lacking the conviction it usually carried. You know that. I have no one else. No family. No history. Just you and the life you've given me. His fingers tightened on my shoulders, hard enough to bruise, and he leaned down, bringing his face close to my neck, inhaling deeply as if trying to smell the lies evaporating off my skin like cheap perfume. That is what you told me, he murmured against the sensitive skin beneath my ear, his lips brushing the pulse point that was beating frantically against his mouth. You told me you were alone in this world, that the fire took your parents, and the foster system took your childhood, leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a desperate need to be saved. He pulled back slowly, his eyes locking onto mine in the reflection once more. And then, with a movement so casual it was almost insulting, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. My heart stopped, actually, physically stopped, for a beat, skipping its rhythm as I recognized the header of the document, the distinctive logo of the offshore bank I had foolishly thought was secure, a fortress of privacy that not even the devil himself could breach. He unfolded the paper with agonizing slowness, smoothing out the creases on the mahogany surface of the vanity table, placing it next to my diamond earrings and my grandmother's locket, the only truthful thing I owned, forcing me to look at the numbers printed there in stark, undeniable black ink. $5,000 a month, Kalen read, his tone devoid of anger, which was infinitely more terrifying than if he had been screaming, because his calm was the calm of a judge delivering a death sentence. For 6 months, regular as clockwork, transmitted from the allowance I give you for clothes and trinkets, routed through a shell corporation in the Caymans, and finally depositing into a private medical trust in Zurich. I tried to speak, to formulate a denial, but my throat had constricted until it felt like I was swallowing razor blades, and all that came out was a strangled, pathetic whimper that sounded entirely too guilty. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the walls stretching and warping as vertigo washed over me, because this wasn't just about money, it wasn't just about theft. It was about the unraveling of the intricate tapestry of lies I had woven to keep Ren safe from the monsters who had destroyed our family. If Kalen knew about the money, he was only one step away from knowing about the patient. And if he found the patient, he would find the name Vance. And the war that had ended 15 years ago would restart in this very bedroom. I can explain, I finally managed to whisper, though we both knew that was a lie, because there was no explanation for this that didn't end with a bullet in my head, or worse, a bullet in Ren's brain. Can you? Kalen asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dangerous purr as he trailed a finger down the side of my face, tracing the line of my jaw as if contemplating exactly how much pressure it would take to snap it. Because to me, it looks like my pet has been biting the hand that feeds her, stealing scraps from the table to feed a ghost I didn't know existed. He grabbed a handful of my hair, forcing my head back so I had to look up at him directly, breaking the safety of the mirror's reflection and forcing me to confront the raw, unadulterated violence simmering just beneath his polished exterior. I don't tolerate thieves, Ilara, and I tolerate liars even less. So you have exactly 5 seconds to tell me who is receiving this money, before I decide that your beautiful mouth is better suited for screaming than speaking. It's blackmail, I stammered, the lie tasting like ash on my tongue, desperate and clumsy. Someone from my old neighborhood, they found out I was with you. They threatened to tell the press about my past, about the things I did to survive. I didn't want to embarrass you, Kalen, I swear. For a moment, just a fleeting heartbeat, I thought he might believe me. But then a cold, cruel smile touched the corners of his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I knew I had made a fatal error. Kalen. The Saint Santo didn't fear the press, nor did he care about the sordid details of a street rat's past. He controlled the press. He owned the streets. And the idea that I would try to handle a threat without bringing it to him was more insulting than the theft itself. blackmail, he repeated, testing the word as if tasting wine, before shaking his head slowly, a disappointed father correcting a wayward child. If it were blackmail, you would have come to me, and I would have peeled the skin from their bodies while you watched, because no one threatens what is mine. He released my hair and took a step back, reaching for the heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey he had left on the nightstand the night before, swirling the amber liquid as he watched me with that unnerving, predatory focus. But you didn't come to me, which means you are protecting someone you value more than your own safety, more than your loyalty to me. And that, Ilara, is a betrayal I cannot overlook. Tears began to blur my vision, hot and stinging, spilling over my lashes and tracking through the expensive powder on my cheeks, creating rivers of vulnerability that I hated myself for showing. Please, Kaylin, I begged, turning in the chair to face him, my hands clasping together in a prayer for mercy that I knew I didn't deserve. It's nothing. It's just a mistake. I'll stop the payments. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't ask me to. I'm not asking. He cut me off, his voice cracking like a whip, shattering the last remnants of my composure. My forensic accountant is already tracing the beneficiary, peeling back the layers of corporate obfuscation you thought were so clever, and within the hour I will have a name, an address, and a photograph. He set the glass down with a sharp clack and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle, turning back to look at me one last time, his silhouette framed by the light of the hallway, casting a long, dark shadow that seemed to swallow me whole. You have been living a double life, sleeping in my bed while your heart was somewhere else, sending resources to a stranger while claiming you were mine alone. He's not a stranger, I screamed, the words tearing out of my throat before I could stop them, the pressure of the secret finally becoming too great to contain. And instantly the room went dead silent, the air sucked out as if by a vacuum. Kaylin froze, his hand tightening on the door handle until his knuckles turned white. And slowly, terrifyingly, he turned back around, his eyes alight with a dark, triumphant fire, having goaded me into admitting exactly what he suspected. He, Kaylin whispered, the pronoun hanging in the air between us like a toxic cloud. So it is a man? I clapped a hand over my mouth, horror washing over me as I realized what I had done. But it was too late to call the words back. Too late to shove the genie back into the bottle because I had just confirmed his worst suspicion. Another male had a claim on his property. He walked back toward me, not with the slow stalk of a predator this time, but with the purposeful stride of an executioner, grabbing my wrist and hauling me up from the chair so fast my head spun, pulling me against his hard chest until I could feel the steady, furious beat of his heart against my own. Is he a lover? Kaylin hissed, his face inches from mine, his eyes searching my soul for the infidelity he was imagining. Is he some gutter trash you left behind? A husband you forgot to mention? No, I sobbed, shaking my head violently, terrified that if he believed it was a lover, he would kill Ren simply out of jealousy before he even found out about the blood feud. It's not like that, Kaylin. I swear on my life it's not romantic. Please, you have to believe me. Then who is he? He roared, the sudden volume making me flinch, his control finally fracturing under the weight of his possessive rage. Who is worth lying to me for? Who is worth stealing from the Santo family for? Tell me his name. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The walls were closing in and the floor was dropping out from under me, and I knew that whatever I said next would determine whether I lived or died, whether Ren continued to receive the care that kept him tethered to this world, or whether they pulled the plug and let him fade away into the darkness. I opened my mouth, desperate to spin another web, to create a cousin, an uncle, anyone harmless. But the look in Kaylin's eyes told me that he was done with games, done with fables, and that he would tear the truth out of me piece by piece if he had to. I can't, I whispered brokenly, my body sagging in his grip. I can't tell you. Kaylin stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his expression shifting from rage to something colder, something far more dangerous. determination. He released my wrist with a shove that sent me stumbling back against the vanity, the edge of the table digging into my spine, and he pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen with precise, angry movements. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the passion that had been there only seconds ago. "We are going to the airfield." "Where?" I gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. "Where are you taking me?" He held up the phone, the screen displaying a map with a blinking red dot located in the Swiss Alps, a location I knew intimately, a location I had paid a fortune to keep hidden. "To meet this mystery man of yours," Kalen said, his eyes promising a violence that made my blood run cold. "And once I see him, once I look him in the eye, I will decide whether to kill him quickly or whether to make you watch while I take him apart slow enough to make you wish you had never been born." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my careful lies, knowing that the plane ride would be a torture session all its own. But the real horror waited at the end of the journey, where the only family I had left was sleeping defenseless in a glass room, unaware that the devil was coming to collect his due. I looked at the open door, realizing with a sickening lurch that running was no longer an option. Fighting was no longer an option. The only thing left was to walk into the fire and pray that when Kalen realized who Ren was, he would love me enough to spare the son of the man he hated most. Or more likely, that he would simply kill us both and be done with the cursed Vance bloodline once and for all. The commands Kalen had issued hung in the opulent silence of the bedroom like the suspended blade of a guillotine, waiting for the slightest provocation to drop and sever the fragile threads of my existence. And as his heavy footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving me alone with the ruins of my deception, I felt a paralysis seize my limbs that was born of a terror so ancient and primal, it felt as though it were encoded in my very DNA. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling as heavy and unresponsive as lead weights, dragging myself toward the walk-in closet where rows of designer gowns and cashmere coats mocked me with their superficial luxury. Reminders of the gilded cage I had willingly walked into for the sake of a brother who didn't even know my name anymore. My hands shook violently as I pulled a leather weekend bag from the top shelf, the rich scent of the tanned hide mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline that coated my tongue, and though my brain was screaming at me to run, to smash the window and climb down the fire escape, I knew with a sickening certainty that Kalen had already stationed his guards at every exit, effectively sealing the penthouse into a high-altitude prison. While I tossed random items of clothing into the bag, silk blouses I didn't care about, lingerie Kalen had bought me, shoes that were too high for running, my mind raced through a labyrinth of frantic calculations, desperately seeking a variable I could control, a signal I could send to the facility in Zurich before we arrived, because if Kalen walked into that room without warning, if he saw the face of the boy strapped to the bed, he would recognize the features of his father's murderer in an instant. I needed to warn the administrators. I needed to tell them to hide Ren, to switch his room, to falsify the records, to do anything that might buy us a few precious hours of anonymity. But my primary phone had been confiscated the moment I entered Kalen's world, leaving me with only the secret burner I had purchased with cash 3 months ago. I dropped to my knees on the floor of the closet, pushing aside a stack of shoeboxes to reveal the loose parquet tile in the far corner, my fingernails scrabbling against the wood in a desperate frenzy that threatened to tear them from their beds, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like the whimpering of a wounded animal. I pried the board up, my heart hammering against my ribs with enough force to crack bone, praying to a god I hadn't believed in since the night my parents were slaughtered that the device would still be there, that the blinking blue light of a notification would be my salvation. But when the wood finally gave way, and I peered into the dark cavity beneath, I was met with nothing but dust and the crushing, suffocating weight of failure. The hollow space was empty, stripped of the one lifeline I had managed to secure, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. bowing my spine and pressing my forehead against the cold floor as a sob tore through my chest, carrying with it the last remnants of my hope. "Looking for this, Alara?" The voice came from the doorway, smooth and dark like oil slicking over water, and I whipped my head around to see Kalen standing there, his silhouette framed by the harsh light of the bedroom, holding the cheap black plastic phone between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of evidence in a murder trial, which, in a way, I suppose it was. He didn't look angry in the traditional sense, which made the sight of him infinitely more terrifying. He looked disappointed, weary, like a man who had expected better from a favored pet, but was unsurprised by its feral nature. And as he stepped into the closet, the small space suddenly felt microscopic, the air growing thin and difficult to breathe. "I found it 2 days ago," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and into my knees. "Tucked away like a dirty secret beneath the floor of the home I gave you, hidden from the man who has given you everything. And I waited, Alara. I waited to see if you would use it to call a lover, to sell my secrets to my enemies, or to plan an escape." He tossed the phone onto the pile of silk clothes in my open bag, the clatter of the plastic sounding deafening in the quiet room, and he leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes cold and assessing as they bored into mine. "You called a number in Zurich," he continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with a lethal edge. "A secure line registered to a psychiatric facility that caters to the discarded relatives of the European elite, a place where people go to be forgotten. And I found myself wondering why my beautiful orphan girl was calling a madhouse in the middle of the night." I stayed on my knees, unable to stand under the weight of his scrutiny, my hands clutching the edge of the floorboard as if it were the edge of a cliff, tears streaming down my face in hot, humiliating rivers. "It's not what you think," I whispered, the lie sounding pathetic even to my own ears, a desperate attempt to deflect the inevitable. But Kalen merely tilted his head, his expression unyielding. "I don't think, Alara, No," he corrected me, pushing off the doorframe and looming over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. "I know you have been lying to me since the moment we met. I know there is someone in that clinic who means more to you than I do, and I know that you are terrified of what I will do when I find out who they are." He reached down, gripping my upper arm and hauling me to my feet, with a strength that was effortless and overwhelming, pulling me close until I could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath and see the intricate flecks of silver in his storm-gray eyes. "Finish packing," he ordered, releasing me with a shove that sent me stumbling back toward the suitcase. "The car is waiting, and I am not a man who enjoys being late for his own revelations." The drive to the private airfield was a blur of rain-slicked streets and blinding neon lights that smeared against the tinted windows of the armored SUV, a kaleidoscopic nightmare that mirrored the fracturing of my own psyche as I sat rigidly beside the man who held my life in his hands. The silence in the car was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that stifled any attempt at conversation, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine, sounds that seemed to amplify the pounding of my own heart. I stared out the window, watching the city of New York fade into the distance, the skyline a jagged row of teeth threatening to chew me up and spit me out. And I thought of Ren, alone in his white room, staring at a wall with eyes that saw only the horrors of our past, unaware that his sister was bringing the devil right to his doorstep. When we arrived at the tarmac, the private jet sat waiting like a sleek, silver predator crouched on the runway, its engines whining in anticipation of the flight. And as the driver opened my door, the cold wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks and bringing tears to my eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. Kalen gripped my elbow as we ascended the stairs, his touch possessive and firm, a silent reminder that I was his prisoner in all but name. And as we stepped into the luxurious cabin with its cream leather seats and polished walnut tables, I felt the finality of the trap snapping shut. There was no escaping at 30,000 feet, no running from the truth in a pressurized metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere. And as the door sealed shut with a heavy thud, sealing my fate along with it, I sank into one of the seats and closed my eyes, praying for the plane to crash, for the earth to open up, for anything that would prevent the collision of my two worlds. The flight was agonizingly long, a stretch of hours that felt like decades, during which Kalen ignored me completely, focusing his attention on a stack of files and a tablet that glowed with a harsh blue light, his face illuminated in the dim cabin like a marble statue of a vengeful god. I sat across from him, sipping water I couldn't swallow and staring at the clouds stretching out below us like a field of snow, my mind replaying the night my parents died, the night the Santos raided our estate, the night I hid Ren in the dumbwaiter and listened to the sounds of slaughter echoing through the halls. I had spent 15 years running from that night, changing my name, dyeing my hair, erasing every trace of the Vance legacy from my existence, only to end up in the bed of the son of the man who ordered the hit. A twisted irony that felt like a cosmic joke played at my expense. "Eat," Kalen said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence and making me jump, his eyes still fixed on the screen of his tablet. "You haven't touched the food the stewardess brought, and I will not have you fainting on me when we arrive." "I'm not hungry," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, turning my head to look at him, searching his profile for any sign of mercy, any hint that the man who had held me while I slept was still in there somewhere. "Kalen, please. You don't have to do this. Whatever you find, whatever you think you know, can't we just go back? I'll stop the payments. I'll never lie to you again. Just please don't make me go there." He finally looked up, setting the tablet down on the table with a deliberate slowness that sent a shiver down my spine, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. "You still think this is about the money," he said, shaking his head slightly, a dark amusement playing on his lips. "You think I am dragging you across the Atlantic because you stole a few $1,000s, when in reality, I am taking you there because I need to know why you were willing to risk my wrath for a stranger." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You are not a thief by nature, Ilara. You are a survivor, a creature of instinct and self-preservation. So for you to risk everything you have built here, everything I have given you, this person must be the anchor that holds you to the earth, the one weakness in your armor." He's just a friend," I lied, the words trembling on my lips. "Someone I grew up with in the foster system. He got sick. He had no one else. I couldn't just let him die, Kalen, I couldn't." "A friend," he repeated, his tone skeptical, his gaze drifting back to the tablet on the table, where a progress bar was slowly inching toward completion, a decryption program hacking through the layers of security I had placed around Ren's file. "My team tells me that the account is linked to a patient ID, not a name, which means you paid extra for anonymity, another layer of deception that suggests this friend is someone dangerous, or someone who should be dead." The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and dizzy. Because he was right. He was always right. Ren should be dead. He was supposed to have died in the fire that consumed our home, a fact that was recorded in every police report and obituary in the city. If Kalen found out that a male Vance heir had survived, that the bloodline of his enemies was still intact, his code of honor, the omerta that ruled his life, would demand that he finish the job his father started, and I would be forced to watch the only person I loved be executed by the man I had fallen in love with. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our descent into Zurich, and the plane banked sharply to the left, the sudden shift in gravity mirroring the lurch in my stomach as the ground rushed up to meet us. Kalen picked up the tablet again, the light reflecting in his eyes, and I saw a notification pop up on the screen, a green check mark indicating that the file transfer was complete. that the secrets I had buried were now laid bare in digital format, waiting for him to read them. "We are landing," he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, tucking the tablet under his arm without looking at it. A reprieve that made my knees weak with relief, though I knew it was temporary. "The car is waiting on the tarmac, and the facility is only 20 minutes away." He reached out a hand to help me up, his grip firm and unyielding. And as I placed my trembling fingers in his palm, I felt the calluses on his skin, the rough texture of a man who worked with violence, and I wondered if those same hands would be wrapped around my throat before the sun went down. We walked down the air stairs into the biting cold of the Swiss winter, the wind howling across the tarmac like a banshee, and were ushered into another waiting black car, a hearse for my hopes and dreams. As the car pulled away, navigating the winding mountain roads that led to the clinic, Kalen finally unlocked the screen of his tablet, the soft glow illuminating his sharp features in the darkness of the back seat. I watched, paralyzed, as he tapped the file, watched his eyes scan the text, watched the exact moment the information hit his brain and rewired his understanding of who I was. His finger froze on the screen. His breathing stopped for a fraction of a second, and the temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees as he slowly, mechanically, turned his head to look at me. His eyes were no longer gray. They were black, dilated with a rage so profound it transcended anger and entered the realm of madness, a look of betrayal and realization that told me the game was over, the mask was off, and there were no more lies left to tell. "Vance," he whispered, the name leaving his lips like a curse, a foul thing that tasted of blood and history. "You are a Vance." He didn't yell, he didn't strike me, he simply stared at me as if I were a ghost that had materialized to haunt him. And then he looked back at the tablet, scrolling down to the patient profile, to the photograph of Wren, and a dark, terrifying smile spread across his face. The smile of a predator who has just realized that the prey is not only trapped, but that there are two of them. "And this," he said, turning the screen so I could see Wren's gaunt, pale face staring back at me. "This is your brother." The car turned a final corner, the headlights sweeping across the wrought iron gates of the sanitarium, illuminating the sign that promised sanctuary, but would now become a slaughterhouse. And Kalen leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear, his voice a promise of pain that made my soul wither. "You said you had no family," he murmured, his hand moving to rest on the handle of the gun holstered beneath his jacket. "Let's go see if we can make that statement true again." The silence that filled the cabin of the luxury sedan following Kalen's devastating pronouncement was not merely an absence of sound, but a physical entity. A crushing, suffocating weight that pressed against my chest with the force of a tectonic plate, effectively pulverizing the last remnants of the hope I had foolishly clung to during our flight across the Atlantic. The name Vance hung in the air between us like the lingering smoke of a gunshot, a single syllable that had resurrected a 15-year-old war within the span of a heartbeat, transforming me from the woman Kalen Santo loved into the living, breathing embodiment of the one thing his family had sworn to eradicate from the face of the earth. I sat paralyzed against the cool leather of the seat, my body vibrating in sympathy with the idling engine, unable to tear my gaze away from the profile of the man who had whispered promises of forever against my skin only last night, but who now looked at me with the cold, dispassionate calculation of a butcher assessing a lamb for the slaughter. When the driver finally rounded the car to open Kalen's door, the influx of freezing alpine air did nothing to cool the burning shame and terror that coursed through my veins, because I knew that stepping out of this vehicle meant stepping into the final act of my life. A tragedy that would inevitably end with blood on the floor. My blood. Wren's blood. The blood of the last two Vances who had dared to survive the purge. Kalen exited the vehicle with a fluid, lethal grace that made my stomach churn, his movements sharp and precise as he buttoned his suit jacket over the gun that I knew was itching to be used. And before I could even attempt to gather my trembling limbs, he was at my door, reaching inside to grip my wrist with fingers that felt like bands of steel, hauling me out into the biting wind with a force that nearly pulled my arm from its socket. He didn't speak. He didn't look at me. He simply dragged me toward the imposing glass entrance of the clinic, his stride long and purposeful, forcing me to stumble and scramble to keep up in my heels, a pathetic figure being led to the gallows by the Grim Reaper himself. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss that sounded like a warning, admitting us into a lobby that smelled of expensive lilies and antiseptic, a jarring contrast to the violence radiating from Kaylin's body in waves so palpable that the receptionist behind the marble desk actually recoiled as we approached. I wanted to scream at her, to beg her to call the police, to tell her that the man in the bespoke Italian suit was a monster who intended to murder a patient. But my throat was constricted with fear. My vocal cords paralyzed by the knowledge that the police in this jurisdiction were likely already on the Santo payroll, or at the very least, smart enough not to interfere with a man who walked with the arrogance of a king. Kaylin didn't bother with the formalities of checking in or asking for a visitor's pass. He simply flashed a gold badge that I had never seen before, likely a high-level security clearance he had purchased along with the facility itself, and stormed past the desk toward the elevators, dragging me along in his wake like unwanted baggage. As the elevator doors closed, sealing us into a small mirrored box that reflected my terror and his rage from 1,000 different angles, I felt the panic rising in my throat like bile, a desperate, clawing need to explain, to make him understand before we reached the 3rd floor, before he saw Ren and made a decision that couldn't be undone. "Kaylin, please," I gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush of breathless desperation. "You have to listen to me. It's not a plot. It's not a scheme for revenge. I didn't get close to you to hurt you. I swear on my mother's grave that I only wanted to keep him safe." He turned his head slowly, the movement mechanical and terrifying, and pinned me to the wall of the elevator with a glare that froze the blood in my veins, his hand moving from my wrist to wrap around my throat, not squeezing enough to choke, but applying just enough pressure to remind me that my life was his to take. "Your mother's grave," he repeated, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that vibrated against my skin. "The grave my father dug. The grave that holds the woman who poisoned the city against the Santos, the woman whose husband ordered the hit on my uncle." He leaned in closer, his eyes dark voids where no light could escape, and I could see the betrayal warring with the hatred in his gaze, a volatile mixture that threatened to explode at any second. "You are the daughter of Marcus Vance," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. "A man who was a disease in this city, and for 6 months you have been sleeping in my bed, eating my food, spending my money, all while carrying the blood of a viper, and you expect me to believe that this was not a long con? That you are not a sleeper agent waiting for the right moment to slide a knife between my ribs?" "I was a child," I cried, tears streaming down my face and wetting his hand. "I was 10 years old when the war ended, Kaylin. I didn't know anything about the politics or the feuds. I just knew that my house was burning and my parents were screaming, and I grabbed my little brother and I ran." The elevator chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that signaled our arrival at the floor where the long-term care patients were housed, and Kaylin released my throat with a shove that sent me hitting the back wall, his expression shifting from anger to a cold, resolved determination. "And now you have stopped running," he said, turning to face the opening doors, "and we will see what kind of man this brother of yours has grown into. Whether he is a warrior plotting his return to the throne, or simply a coward hiding behind his sister's skirts." He grabbed my arm again, his grip bruising, and marched me down the pristine white hallway, the sound of his shoes striking the linoleum echoing like drumbeats of war, while nurses and orderlies scattered out of our path like startled birds, sensing the predatory aura that surrounded him. I tried to dig my heels in, to slow our progress, to buy Ren just a few more seconds of peace before his world was shattered. But Kaylin was an unstoppable force, a juggernaut of vengeance who would not be denied his confrontation. My mind raced back to the last time I had seen Ren, 3 months ago. How frail he had looked, how his eyes had stared through me at horrors only he could see. And a fresh wave of nausea washed over me as I realized that Kalen was expecting a fight, expecting a rival Dawn. And I didn't know how he would react when he found a broken boy instead. We reached the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor, the one marked with the number that had been burned into my memory for years. The room that cost $5,000 a month to maintain, and Kalen stopped abruptly, the sudden cessation of movement nearly sending me sprawling to the floor. He released my arm and drew his weapon, the dark metal of the gun gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and he looked at me with an expression that was almost pitying, though devoid of any warmth. "Open it," he commanded, gesturing to the door with the barrel of the gun. "Show me the heir to the Vance Empire, Ilara. Introduce me to the man you sold your soul to protect." My hand shook so violently that I could barely grasp the handle, my fingers slipping on the cold metal as I tried to turn it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs that felt like a bird trapped in a cage, desperate to escape before the cat arrived. I knew that on the other side of this door lay the truth that would either save us or destroy us, but as I pushed the heavy barrier inward, revealing the dim, quiet room beyond, I prayed that Kalen Santo had enough humanity left in him to see past the name Vance and see the tragedy that lay beneath. The room was bathed in the soft, rhythmic blue light of medical monitors, the steady beeping of a heart rate machine providing a stark counterpoint to the chaotic drumming of my own pulse. And in the center of the room, surrounded by tubes and wires like a fly caught in a technological web, lay Ren. He was awake, if you could call it that. His eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a spot on the ceiling that held some invisible fascination. His body wasted away to skeletal proportions beneath the thin hospital sheet, a stark contrast to the vibrant, laughing boy he had been before the fire took everything from us. I stepped into the room, my legs trembling, and I heard Kalen's breath hitch behind me, a sharp intake of air that signaled his surprise, his confusion, because this was not the rival he had prepared for. This was not a soldier waiting in ambush. This was a ruin of a human being, a living ghost haunting a sterile purgatory. "Ren," I whispered, my voice breaking as I approached the bed, ignoring the gun pointed at my back, ignoring the danger, driven only by the overwhelming need to shield him from the monster in the doorway. "Ren, it's Ilara. I'm here. I'm here." He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. His mind locked in the prison of his trauma, reliving the night of the massacre over and over again in an endless loop of horror that no medicine could break. I turned slowly to face Kalen, placing my body between him and the bed, spreading my arms in a gesture of surrender and defiance, tears blurring my vision as I looked into the eyes of the man I loved, the man who held the power of life and death in his hands. Kalen stood in the doorway, his gun still raised, but his aim wavering slightly, his gaze fixed on the emaciated figure on the bed with a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like recognition, as if he were seeing the ghosts of his own past reflected in Ren's vacant stare. "This," Kalen started, his voice rough, stripped of its earlier polish, struggling to reconcile the reality before him with the narrative he had constructed in his head. "This is Marcus Vance's son? This is the threat?" "He isn't a threat," I screamed, the fear finally transmuting into a hysterical, jagged courage. "He hasn't spoken a word in 15 years, Kalen. He can't feed himself, he can't walk. He doesn't even know who I am most of the days. The money was for nurses, for feeding tubes, for keeping him clean and comfortable because he is the only family I have left, and I promised him I wouldn't let him die." I took a step toward Kalen, ignoring the gun that was now pointed vaguely at my chest, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "You wanted a war? You wanted to kill the last Vance man? Go ahead. Look at him. Shoot him in his bed while he stares at the ceiling. Add another murder to your ledger, punish him for the crime of being born. Finish what your father started. Kaelin lowered the gun slowly, the barrel pointing toward the floor. But the tension in his jaw didn't relax. The storm in his eyes didn't clear. Instead, he stepped fully into the room, allowing the heavy door to click shut behind him, locking us in with the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitor. He walked past me, ignoring my flinch, and approached the bed, looking down at Ren with a clinical, detached curiosity, studying the scars on his arms, the hollowness of his cheeks, the utter absence of life in his eyes. He looks like him, Kaelin murmured, almost to himself, tracing the line of Ren's jaw with his eyes, seeing the resemblance to the man our fathers had fought over, the man whose ambition had bathed the city in blood. He has Marcus's eyes. He has nothing, I sobbed, collapsing to my knees beside the bed, grabbing Ren's cold, limp hand in mine. He has nothing but pain, Kaelin. Please, just let him be. Kill me if you have to, punish me for the lies, but leave him out of it. He's already in hell. Don't send him to another one. Kaelin turned his gaze from Ren to me, looking down at my prostrate form with an expression that was unreadable, a mask of stone that hid the chaotic calculations I knew were running through his mind. He was a businessman, a strategist, a man who dealt in leverage and debts, and I saw the moment the realization hit him. The realization that he didn't need to kill Ren to hurt me, that killing him would be a mercy compared to the power he now held over me. He holstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion that sent a shiver of dread down my spine, because I knew that when Kaelin Santo put away his weapon, it meant he had found a tool that was far more effective than a bullet. "Get up," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the rage that had propelled us here, replaced by a chilling, absolute authority. I scrambled to my feet, wiping my face with the back of my hand, waiting for the verdict, waiting for the sentence. "You thought I was angry because you were hiding a rival," he said, stepping close to me, trapping me against the metal railing of the hospital bed, his body heat searing through my thin dress. "But I am angry because you didn't trust me, because you thought you had to bear this burden alone, because you didn't realize that everything you are, everything you have, and everyone you love belongs to me." He reached out and cupped my face, his thumb brushing away a tear with a tenderness that felt like a knife blade, and he leaned down until his forehead rested against mine, forcing me to look into the abyss of his eyes. "I will not kill him," he whispered, and for a second relief flooded through me, so potent it nearly knocked me over. But then he continued, and the relief turned to ash in my mouth. "Killing him would be too easy, too quick. Instead, I am going to keep him, Alara, just as I keep you." He pulled back, a dark smile playing on his lips, a smile that promised a lifetime of servitude. "I am buying this facility," he announced, the words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. "I will pay for his doctors, his treatments, his machines. I will keep him alive for 100 years if I have to. And every time you look at him, every time you see him breathing, you will remember who holds the plug, who pays the bills, and who owns the very air he breathes." My blood ran cold as the magnitude of his words sank in. He wasn't offering charity. He was fastening a collar around my neck, using my brother's life as the chain that would bind me to him forever. "You own me," I whispered, the admission tasting of defeat and despair. "You know you own me." "Not yet," Kaelin replied, glancing back at Ren's vacant stare before turning his burning gaze back to me. "But you will learn, little liar. You will learn that there is no family but the one I allow, no loyalty but the one I command. And tonight, right here in front of the ghost of our father's war, we are going to seal that contract in blood." He reached for the button on the wall that dimmed the lights further, casting the room into semi-darkness. And as he began to unbutton his jacket, his eyes never leaving mine, I realized that the interrogation was over. But the punishment, the twisted, possessive claiming that would strip away the last of my independence, was just beginning. The air in the sterile, blue-lit room seemed to thicken into a viscous substance that coated my lungs and made every shallow breath a labor of immense difficulty, as if the very atmosphere were bowing under the weight of Kalen Santo's overwhelming presence. He stood before me, his jacket discarded on the foot of my brother's bed, like a flag planted on conquered soil. And though he had not raised his hand to me, the sheer, radiating intensity of his possessiveness pinned me against the cold observation glass more effectively than any shackle or chain ever could. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he rolled up the sleeves of his pristine white dress shirt, revealing the intricate ink of the tattoos that wound around his forearms, symbols of his violence, his loyalty, and his history, muscles cording beneath the skin as he prepared to dismantle the last remnants of my resistance with the same surgical precision he used to dismantle his enemies. "Look at him," Kalen commanded, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that resonated in the hollow spaces of my chest, his hand reaching out to grip my chin and forcibly turning my head so that I had no choice but to stare at Ren's pale, lifeless profile, illuminated by the ghostly glow of the machinery. "Look at the boy you sacrificed your freedom for. Look at the fragile thread that ties you to a past that died in flames 15 years ago. And realize, Ilara, that he is no longer your burden to carry. Because as of this moment, every beat of his heart is a gift that I am choosing to give him." The tears that leaked from my eyes felt hot and acidic against my skin, burning trails of shame and relief down my cheeks. Because while the monster in front of me was effectively holding a blade to my brother's throat, he was also the only force powerful enough to keep the wolves at bay, the only man with pockets deep enough to sustain the artificial life that Ren required. I trembled under his touch, my hands pressed flat against the glass behind me for support, feeling the cold seep into my palms as I whispered a broken acknowledgement, a surrender that tasted like ash and iron on my tongue. "He is all I have," I managed to choke out, the words fracturing in the silence. "He is the only piece of me that isn't a lie, Kalen. And if you hurt him, if you let him die to punish me, you will destroy the only part of me that is worth owning." Kalen released my chin and stepped into my personal space, his body a wall of heat and hardness that pressed me further into the glass, his hips pinning mine with a dominance that was unmistakably sexual yet terrifyingly clinical, blurring the lines between lover and captor until I couldn't tell where the fear ended and the arousal began. He braced his hands on the window on either side of my head, caging me in, and leaned down until his lips were brushing the shell of my ear, sending shivers cascading down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You still don't understand the nature of this transaction," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. "I don't destroy what is mine, Ilara. And as long as you understand that you are mine, body, soul, past, and future, then your brother falls under the umbrella of my protection, a ward of the Santo Empire, untouchable by anyone but me." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, and I saw the darkness swirling in his gray irises, a storm of obsession that had swallowed me whole without me even realizing it. And I knew then that the man I had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by the Don who negotiated with lives instead of currency. "You tried to be a martyr," he continued, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip, dragging it down to expose the wet pink flesh inside. "You tried to carry the weight of the Vance legacy on your back, sneaking around in the shadows, stealing crumbs from my table, when you could have just given it to me. You could have laid your burdens at my feet and let me carry them, but you didn't trust me." "I was afraid," I confessed, the truth finally tearing its way out of my throat, raw and bleeding. "I was afraid you would see the name in his file and see an enemy instead of a broken boy. I was afraid you would finish the war, Kalen. How could I risk him on the hope that you would be merciful?" "And now?" he asked, his gaze drifting over my shoulder to the bed, where Ren lay oblivious to the negotiation for his life. "Are you still afraid?" "Yes," I whispered, meeting his gaze. I am more afraid now than I have ever been, because before I was just hiding a secret, but now I am beholden to a monster who holds the power to unplug my entire world with a single phone call. A dark, satisfied smile curled the corners of his mouth, a predator accepting the submission of its prey, and he leaned in to capture my lips in a kiss that was not gentle, not kind, but a searing brand of possession that tasted of whiskey and dominance, stealing the breath from my lungs and replacing it with his own. He kissed me until my knees buckled, until my hands clutched at the lapels of his shirt to keep from sliding to the floor, until the only reality in the universe was the crushing weight of his body against mine, and the terrifying knowledge that I belonged to him completely. When he finally pulled away, leaving my lips swollen and bruised, he didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with a casual indifference that belied the magnitude of his next action. "It is done," he said, turning the screen toward me so I could see the confirmation of a wire transfer that contained more zeros than I could comprehend. A sum that transferred ownership of the entire clinic to a holding company I knew belonged to the Santos. "The doctors work for me now. The security guards are being replaced by my men as we speak, and no one enters or leaves this room without my express permission, which means your brother is now the safest invalid in Europe, provided you keep your end of the bargain." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling at the speed with which he had maneuvered, realizing that he had not just bought a building. He had bought a prison for Ren, and a leash for me, ensuring that I could never run, never hide, never disobey, because the cost of my rebellion would be paid in the currency of my brother's life. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the medical equipment. "You have everything already." "I want the truth," he said, pocketing the phone and grabbing his jacket from the bed, shrugging into it with a movement that signaled the end of the audience. "I want you to walk out of this room and leave the name Vance behind forever. Leave it here in this glass box with the ghost of your brother. And when we walk out those doors, you are Ilara Santo in everything but the paperwork, and you will never, ever keep a secret from me again." He held out his hand, palm up, a silent invitation that was actually a command, and I looked from his hand to Ren's sleeping face, saying a silent goodbye to the independence I had fought so hard to maintain, grieving the loss of the girl who thought she could outsmart the devil. I reached out and placed my hand in Kaylin's, his fingers closing over mine like a steel trap, and as he led me toward the door, turning his back on the boy who was now his hostage, I knew that we were moving toward a future where love and slavery were indistinguishable, bound together by a debt that could never be fully repaid. We walked out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind us with the finality of a coffin lid, and I didn't look back. Because looking back was for people who had a past, and Kaylin Santo had just ensured that from this moment on, he was my only history. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us with a finality that reverberated through the marrow of my bones like the tolling of a funeral bell, sealing my brother and my past inside that sterile glass aquarium and signaling the absolute death of Ilara Vance, leaving only the woman Kaylin Santo had forged in the fires of his obsession to walk down the pristine hallway at his side. As we moved away from the room where the last male heir of my bloodline lay, dreaming in a chemically induced twilight, I felt a strange, phantom sensation of lightness, as if the crushing weight of the secrets I had carried for 15 years had been physically stripped from my shoulders and placed into the terrifyingly capable hands of the man who now guided me toward the exit with a grip that was possessive enough to leave bruises and tender enough to break my heart. The nurses and security guards we passed averted their eyes, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, instinctively recognizing that the dynamic between the predator and his prey had evolved into something far more complex and permanent, a symbiotic alignment of power and submission that made us untouchable to everyone but each other. When we stepped out into the biting cold of the Swiss night, the wind howling around us like the tormented spirits of our ancestors, I didn't flinch or pull away, but instead leaned into Kaylin's solid warmth, understanding with a crystal clarity that the harsh, unforgiving world outside his protection would tear me apart the moment I stepped beyond his reach. The drive back to the airfield was undertaken in a silence that was no longer heavy with the threat of impending violence, but rather weighted with the gravity of a marriage vow spoken in a graveyard. A solemn understanding that the lines of battle had been redrawn to include me within the ramparts of the Santo Empire, not as a prisoner of war, but as a prize that had been conquered, claimed, and integrated into the very foundation of his power. Kalen kept his hand on my thigh the entire ride, his fingers flexing rhythmically against the silk of my dress, a constant grounding reminder that while I had lost my freedom, I had gained a protector who would burn the world down before he let anyone else touch what belonged to him. Once we were airborne, the lights of Zurich fading into a glittering constellation beneath the wings of the jet, Kalen finally turned to me, pouring 2 glasses of amber whiskey with a steady hand and sliding one across the polished walnut table, an offering of peace that felt more like a communion sacrament. "Drink," he commanded softly, his eyes tracing the contours of my face as if memorizing a map of a territory he had just annexed. "Because tonight we are not celebrating a victory or mourning a loss, but acknowledging a truth that should have been spoken the moment I found you in that rainstorm 6 months ago." I lifted the glass, the crystal cool against my trembling fingers, and took a long swallow of the burning liquid, letting the heat settle in my stomach as I looked back at him, seeing not the monster I had feared would execute my brother, but the architect of my survival, who had looked at the wreckage of my lineage and decided to build a fortress around it rather than burn it to ash. "You hate my name," I whispered, the alcohol loosening the knot in my chest just enough to let the words escape. "You hate the blood that runs in my veins because it is the same blood that spilled your uncle's. And yet you are bringing me back to your city, back to your bed, knowing exactly what I am." Kalen stood up and moved around the table, sinking onto the seat beside me and pulling me into his lap, with a fluidity that brokered no argument, wrapping his arms around my waist and burying his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling the scent of my fear and my resignation. "I do not hate your blood, Ilara," he murmured against my skin, his voice vibrating through me. "I hate the lies, I hate the distance, but the blood is just history, and history is written by the victors, which means that from this night forward your blood is whatever I say it is." He lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away, leaving us suspended in the darkness of the sky, 2 souls bound together by a twisted tapestry of fate and vengeance. "You are no longer a Vance," he declared, his voice taking on the cadence of a sacred oath. "You are the payment for your father's sins, the collateral for your brother's life, and the queen of my kingdom, and there is no force on earth, living or dead, that will ever take you from me now that I know the depth of your loyalty to those you love." I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful thrum of his heart, realizing that my cage was made of gold and diamonds, but it was a cage nonetheless. Yet for the first time in my life, I didn't want to find the key, because the freedom I had craved was cold and lonely, while this captivity was warm and safe. I thought of Ren, sleeping peacefully in his glass room, surrounded by the best doctors money could buy, safe from the shadows that haunted us, and I knew that the price of his safety was my absolute surrender, a price I would pay 1,000 times over without hesitation. "I am yours," I said, the words falling from my lips not as a defeat, but as a final acceptance of my destiny, a verbal signature on the invisible contract that now bound our lives together. "I will never hide from you again, Kalen. I will never keep a secret, and I will be whatever you need me to be, as long as you keep him safe." He kissed me then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of whiskey and forever, a seal of ownership that branded my soul more effectively than iron. And as the plane carried us back toward the city that our fathers had fought to control, I realized that the war was finally over. The hatred that had decimated our families had not ended with a bullet or a bomb, but with this twisted, beautiful, terrifying love that had grown in the cracks of our broken pasts. A love that was dark enough to hide the monsters and strong enough to hold the ghosts at bay. We were no longer two separate warring factions, but a single, terrified entity bound by a contract written in the ink of my secrets and signed with the blood of our fathers, hurtling through the dark, toward a future where the name Vance would be whispered only as a legend, buried beneath the crushing, protective weight of the name Santo. I closed my eyes as Kaylin's hand tangled in my hair, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us, and I finally allowed myself to sleep, knowing that when I woke up, I would no longer be the girl running from the fire, but the woman who had learned to live within the flame. It has been exactly 365 days since the night the plane touched down in Zurich, a year measured not in hours or minutes, but in the rhythmic, hypnotic beeping of a heart monitor, streamed live to a tablet that Kaylin places on my nightstand every single morning before the sun has even dared to crest the horizon. The woman who stands before the floor-to-ceiling mirrors of the penthouse tonight, draped in a gown of liquid silver that clings to her curves like a second skin, bears little resemblance to the desperate, frightened girl who once hid burner phones under floorboards and siphoned pennies from a dragon's hoard. That girl is dead, buried in the Swiss Alps, along with the last remnants of the Vance name, replaced by this polished, diamond-hard creature who wears the title of Santo, like a crown of thorns. The ballroom below is filled with the city's elite, a sea of sharks in tuxedos and vultures in haute couture waiting to pay homage to the King of New York. But up here, in the quiet sanctuary of our bedroom, the only eyes that matter are the ones watching me from the reflection, gray and possessive and filled with a terrifying adoration that consumes as much as it protects. Kaylin steps up behind me, his reflection towering over mine, his hands settling heavy and warm on my hips, his thumbs brushing against the silk in a proprietary caress that sends a familiar jolt of electricity straight to my core, reminding me that while I may walk through the world as a queen, in this room and in his heart, I am a possession he has fought a war to keep. "You are quiet tonight," he murmurs, his lips grazing the sensitive slope of my neck, his eyes locking onto mine in the glass with an intensity that strips me bare. "Are you thinking of him?" I don't need to ask who him is. Ren is the third presence in our marriage, the silent ghost who dictates the terms of my surrender. And though I know he is safe, cared for by a team of specialists who treat him better than they would a head of state, the knowledge that his life support is powered by Kaylin's goodwill is the chain that keeps me tethered to this life. I am always thinking of him, I admit, leaning back against Kaylin's solid chest, letting his strength support my weight. But I was also thinking about how easy it has become to breathe in this cage you built for me. How the air up here is so thin and pure that I have forgotten what it tastes like to be afraid of anything other than losing you. Kaylin turns me around then, his movements slow and deliberate, framing my face with his large, rough hands, forcing me to look at the man who murdered my family's legacy, only to resurrect me from the ashes. "It is not a cage, Alara," he corrects me, his voice rough with emotion. "It is a fortress, a sanctuary where the past cannot touch us, where the name Vance is just a whisper in the dark, and where you are free to be everything I need you to be." He kisses me, and in the taste of him, dark chocolate and expensive scotch and raw power, I find the final answer to the question that has haunted me since the beginning. I am not a victim of this arrangement, nor am I merely a survivor, but a willing participant in a beautiful, twisted tragedy, where the villain gets the girl, and the girl learns to love the shadows he casts. We pull apart, breathless, and he offers me his arm, the cufflink glinting under the chandelier, a silent invitation to descend into the lion's den by his side, to play the role of the perfect wife to the most dangerous man in the city. I take his arm, my fingers curling around the expensive fabric of his suit. And as we walk toward the door, I glance one last time at the tablet resting on the velvet bench at the foot of the bed, the screen glowing with the steady, reassuring green line of my brother's heartbeat. The debt I owed has been paid, not in cash, but in the currency of my soul. And as I step out into the hallway to rule a kingdom built on blood and secrets, I realize with a chilling clarity that I wouldn't trade my golden shackles for all the freedom in the world.